Hello, and welcome to Tobin Daily. I'm JNS Editor-in-Chief Jonathan Tobin. Thanks for joining me for another discussion on the most pressing issues in the Jewish world. Please like, subscribe, and give us good reviews when you listen to the show. Now let's get started. Are America's institutions of higher education finally taking the post-October 7th surge in antisemitism seriously? According to the New York Times, the answer is that they're taking it far too seriously. That's the upshot of just the latest in a series of articles in the Times and elsewhere in the legacy corporate media seeking to flip the script about the widespread toleration of anti-Semitic activism on college campuses. With many institutions under pressure from Congress and their donors to behave as if they were not complicit in the campaigns of leftist activists to anathematize Jews, there has been a decline in the number and tolerance of demonstrations where mobs chant slogans calling for Jewish genocide. But the reaction to this from liberal journalists is that these so-called crackdowns are the real outrage. According to the Times, the problem is that in a foolish attempt to assuage the hurt feelings of some Jews and to avoid the potential wrath of the federal government, colleges have suppressed pro-Palestinian activists. As proof of this, the article pointed to a study conducted by Harvard University, itself one of the worst offenders in the toleration of anti-Semitic demonstrations, which claimed that the number of pro-Palestinian demonstrations held during the current fall semester at American institutions of higher learning to have numbered only 950. That compares to what it says were more than 3,000 such events during the 2024 spring semester. And while more than 3,100 arrests were made at demonstrations in the spring, so far Harvard's Nonviolent Action Lab says only about 50 have been arrested since the start of the new academic year. That is being proclaimed by many in higher education, and even some in the Jewish community, as a great improvement. However, while the numbers are lower, congratulations are certainly not in order. Would anyone say that 950 iterations of the neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, in the summer of 2017, rather than thousands of them, would be something for Americans to applaud? Surely not. Yet that is exactly what is being asked, since the pro-Hamas outbreaks represented the moral equivalent of what happened in Charlottesville, replete with anti-Semitic chants, and sometimes, as a photo accompanying the Times article illustrated, with the same sort of imagery of candles held by anti-Israel mobs replacing the tiki torches of the neo-Nazis. In the bizarro world of liberal media, even a reduction in the number of anti-Semitic incidents is itself the problem. While liberal groups would have had no trouble with far more draconian actions being taken against anyone on campus who participated in demonstrations calling for violence against African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, or members of the LGBTQ+ community, the notion that supporters of Hamas and opponents of Israel's existence should be forced to abide by rules that prevented illegal demonstrations or intimidations of a minority group is seen as the real outrage. Taking the lead from those who have organized these demonstrations, which have in some cases been funded by foreign sources like the terrorist-supporting government of Iran, the Times and other liberal media outlets have been treating those engaged in open anti-Semitism as well-meaning idealists who are motivated by concern for the suffering of Palestinian Arabs. The result is, they say, an effort to silence student activists, something that amounts to a form of authoritarianism. Todd Wolfson, president of the American Association of University Professors and an associate professor of media studies at Rutgers University in New Jersey, was quoted as saying that the restrictions imposed on demonstrators have made people afraid. Quote, "They feel like they're being watched and surveilled," he said. "I think there's a strong degree of self-censorship that's taking place." The Times admitted to say that the association he heads has, under his leadership, reversed its long opposition to academic boycotts in order to support anti-Semitic BDS campaigns, which amount to illegal discrimination against Israel, Israelis, and those who advocate for the Jewish state. As historian Neil Ferguson wrote last December in the Free Press, what has happened in American academia is a new version of the treason of the intellectuals in the 1920s and 30s, as the intelligentsia justified a wave of fascist and Nazi antisemitism in European institutions of higher learning. They too portrayed themselves as victims of the Jews, and those whom they claimed that the Jews were manipulating, a precursor of today's efforts to depict pressure from alumni, donors, and politicians to stop the toleration of Jew hatred as intolerable interference with academic freedom. In many cases, this so-called wave of repression has amounted to nothing more than enforcing previously existing rules of conduct. Such regulations were often ignored after the Hamas-led terrorist attacks in southern Israel on October 7, 2023, as administrators feared the rage of activists who were often as likely to be school employees or faculty members as students, far more than they did for being called out for their inaction. This makes sense once you understand that the impetus for the anti-Israel, anti-Jewish mobs was the conquest of American education by those advocating for critical race theory and intersectionality. These toxic ideas not only seek to divide humanity into two permanently warring groups, white oppressors and the oppressed, the latter of whom are people of color and other designated minorities. They also define Jews and Israelis as white, racist colonialists, and the Palestinians as their victims, even though race has nothing to do with the conflict in the Middle East, and the Jews are the indigenous people of the land of Israel. In this way, nothing Israel does is justifiable, and nothing the Palestinians do, including the unspeakable atrocities of October 7th, is not justified. This belief has become not so much the current intellectual fashion as the reigning orthodoxy on campuses, as well as in many K-12 schools, as a result of the imposition of the woke catechism of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, being imposed on so much of American society. Though supposedly intended to promote justice, the result of indoctrination in ideas like equity, which is the opposite of equal opportunity, and the veneration of diversity and inclusion that excludes non-leftist views and stigmatizes Jews, has fueled a surge in antisemitism. It was this sort of thinking that caused 3 university presidents to testify to Congress last December that it depended on the context as to whether advocacy for the genocide of Jews would violate the rules of their schools. In the name of this new secular faith, in the months following the October 7th massacre conducted by Hamas and other Palestinian terrorists, thousands of demonstrations took place at universities and colleges, which students, faculty, and staff proclaimed their support for anti-Jewish terrorism, globalized the Intifada, Hamas, and its genocidal goal of destroying the Jewish state from the river to the sea. Campus buildings were taken over, and other public spaces were allowed to be turned into encampments, effectively making it difficult, if not impossible, for students who understandably worried for their safety to challenge crowds voicing support for the slaughter of Jews, and sometimes to even get to classes. But we are now being told that the effort to curb this scourge is itself the problem. That's hardly surprising, since the chattering classes are still largely blind to the way their embrace of woke ideology and hostility to Israel and its right to defend itself against genocidal terrorists has unleashed an unprecedented increase in American anti-Semitism. Indeed, outlets like The Times are still promoting the idea that the victory of President-elect Donald Trump in the presidential election represents the real threat of a revival of Nazi-like authoritarianism. The day before it published its article about the supposedly deplorable crackdown against Hamas, The Times ran an article authored by Joel Grey, who played the MC in the 1966 original Broadway production of the musical Cabaret and the 1972 film version. The 92-year-old actor-singer analogized the election results to the events depicted in the play, whereby the rise of Nazi thugs created an anti-Semitic regime in Germany. Americans, he wrote, had enabled, quote, the democratic election of an authoritarian figure, the normalization of bigotry, and that this was done with the complicity of the frightened masses. To write about the re-election of a pro-Israel politician who had done more to combat anti-Semitism on college campuses in his first term than any of his predecessors in this manner is an outrageous slander. But to do so 13 months after October 7th, while 101 men, women, and children are still being held hostage in the Gaza Strip and Jews are being murdered elsewhere, is indicative of the tunnel vision of liberal Americans, including Jews like Gray, who are unwilling to think clearly about what constitutes the main threat to Jewish security in the 21st century. Rather than face up to the reality of left-wing anti-Semitism masquerading as pro-Palestinian activism, they prefer to recycle conspiracy theories and fear-mongering about their partisan foes. In such an intellectual atmosphere in academia and the arts, it's hardly surprising that the legacy media is whitewashing Jew haters on campus and urging that universities go easy on them. The irony to this is that it is exactly Trump's election win that provides the best hope for effective action against campus anti-Semitism. He promised a real crackdown, including cutting off funding for universities that tolerate pro-Hamas mobs, intimidating Jewish students, and deporting those foreign students, many of whom come from Arab and Muslim countries, who take part in pro-Hamas, pro-terror activities. Those who truly care about Jewish security should hope that Trump keeps this promise in the same manner as the way that he kept his vow to move the U.S. Embassy to Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in his first term. Given the pro-Israel and philo-Semitic beliefs of his cabinet appointments for his second term, there's every reason to hope that this will happen. That's a plan of action that will not only help American Jews. There's good reason to believe that the Trump 2.0 Department of Justice will begin action to target those institutions that engage in racial discrimination in the name of DEI policies, rather than enabling it, as it did under the Biden and Obama administrations. If so, the result will be a much-needed turning of the tide that will roll back the leftist takeover of education that helped exacerbate racial, ethnic, and religious division. Rather than worrying about repressing activities and anti-Semites on campus, people of goodwill, whether liberal or conservative, Democrat or Republican, Jewish or non-Jewish, should applaud the justified punishment of those who have mainstreamed and normalized anti-Semitism since October 7th. Those who oppose such measures are defending hate, not free speech. Thanks for listening. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition and every week for Think Twice, my full-length JNS TV program. Whether you're listening to us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, or any of the other podcast platforms, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself.